He may have been one of the greatest civil rights leaders of the 19th century. So who was he, and why has almost no one ever heard of him?
It's a story we don't hear about as much because it takes place in Iowa.
Funding for Lost in History, Alexander Clark, has been provided by William Penn University and Musco Lighting, who are proud to support the telling of this Iowa story. Thanks for joining us. I'm Simon Estes. In the 1860s, more than 80 years before the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling integrating America's schools, an African-American teenager growing up in eastern Iowa was denied admission to the high school where the white kids went. Her father went to court to fight the decision and won. And the rest, as they say, is history. Except, chances are you won't find a single sentence in your history books about it. Despite his remarkable court challenge and all his other great accomplishments, this man has practically disappeared from history. This program is meant to set the record straight. Despite its vast and abundant farmland, parts of eastern Iowa don't look a lot different during the early summer months than much of the rest of the state or the nation. Cars whiz by on Interstate 80. Small towns are clogged with traffic. Even during hard times, consumers crowd shopping malls, buying the latest gadgets that inform and amuse them. But hidden in plain sight are vestiges of another era, not one, but 2 centuries ago, when abolitionists like John Brown came to what was then the American West and joined Congregationalists and Quakers and progressive lawmakers in a struggle against slavery and for rights for African Americans. You have to dig much deeper to discover the critical role one little-known African American played in these parts back then. A man who somehow has been lost from history. His name, Alexander Clark.
Americans should know about Alexander Clark. In his time, he was known as the colored orator of the West, and yet we don't know about him. Alexander Clark has simply dropped out of the story.
If we look at America in 1850 or 1860 or 1870 or 1880, he is the most important black person living west of the Mississippi River. He is a very important figure in the history of race relations and law, but he's also a virtually unknown figure. It's kind of an oddity.
It might have stayed that way were it not for another man born decades after Clark died. His name is Ken Sissel, and long ago, a chance occurrence altered his life. It happened in the 1960s. Sissel, then in his mid-20s, had just completed his master's degree at the University of Iowa. His thesis was about historic architecture. One day, he agrees to take some women to see the sights in an Iowa town on the banks of the Mississippi River.
They asked me if I'd take them on a tour of Muscatine and show them the historic architecture of Muscatine. I agreed. We were driving on 3rd Street and somebody said, "What about this house?" pointing to the Alexander Clark house. And I said, I don't know anything about it. It's an interesting house. I don't know that it's that outstanding architecturally. One of the ladies in the back of the car, whose name was Mabel Bartenhagen, indicated that it was the ambassador's house. I knew nothing about it at that point. Other people said, "Well, who is the ambassador?" And Mabel said, "Well, I don't know, but I guess I'm going to go find out." So people started taking an interest in who Alexander Clark was, what his accomplishments had been in his life, even though most of it was absolutely lost. Absolutely lost.
What begins that day with a simple question he and the others couldn't answer would come to consume much of Ken Sissel's life, including a fair share of his savings. Just who was this ambassador? Over time, Sissel would determine that while he and Clark grew up in different centuries and were from starkly different backgrounds, their family connections actually run deep. from the same town in western Pennsylvania to Muscatine, Iowa, and ultimately to this very house atop a hill overlooking the Mississippi River. It was once Clark's house. Today, it's Sissel's.
Even though it's Alexander Clark's house, I've had the privilege of living there and filling it with wonderful objects, many of which are related to the time period of Alexander Clark.
If you wander downstairs, you'll discover just how entwined their lives have become. Because the mess in the basement is proof of Sissel's endless devotion to Clark and his determination that this man he never knew finds his rightful place in history.
It's almost like I'm doing this for a member of my own family. Can't explain it, but that's how you can do it for 35 years. It's just what I'm supposed to do.
Just how Sissel purchases the house is its own story. In the mid-1970s, Clark's house is supposed to be demolished to make way for this high-rise. But those who know Clark's story protest, and Muscatine officials agree to move the house 100 feet up the hill to its current location. A short time later, the local Historical Preservation Society runs into financial trouble and Sissel is contacted.
I happened to be working in the state of Iowa at that point, and I spent a lot of time in the office of the Division of Historic Preservation in Des Moines. I was contacted and asked if I wouldn't please consider moving back to Muscatine and taking care of the house. And to make a very long story short, I did that, thinking that I would probably come to Muscatine, spend a couple years restoring the house, and go on with my life. 35 years later, I'm still here.
Sissel was not and is not a historian, but over the years, he says he has become the keeper of Clark's history, such as it is known. What is known is this. Clark is born a free man in 1826 in Washington, Pennsylvania, about 30 miles southwest of Pittsburgh. When he turns 13, the young man goes to live with his uncle in Cincinnati. 2 years later, he takes a job as a bartender on the steamship George Washington and finally moves to Muscatine, then known as Bloomington, in 1842, where he soon purchases land near the Mississippi.
The young man goes west. And what does he do when he goes west? He starts out figuring out, how can I make a living? I can make a living by chopping wood and selling it to steamboats, because there's steamboats going up and down the river.
Paul Finkelman is an historian who has spent most of his career studying the relationship between race and the law. Because of the 1868 Iowa desegregation case, Finkelman has studied Clark's life extensively.
In many ways, Alexander Clark is just like thousands and thousands of other young American kids, except he's black. And of course, that makes everything different.
Clark has another skill that gives a young black man unusual access to Muscatine's white power elite. He is a trained barber.
Being a barber is very important in antebellum America. The safety razor has not been invented. And so shaving is a semi-suicidal task for many men. So a lawyer or a doctor or a businessman, he would have to go to the barber on a regular basis for a shave. So Alexander Clark is shaving all of the important men in town. Black barbers tend to be very high up on the internal black social scale because they have access to the power structure of white people. They talk to white people. They also learn about business possibilities. They learn about investments.
Clark does well with his investments. Besides using his land to chop firewood and supply the steamships, he grows vegetables and sells them in the markets in Muscatine. By the late 1840s, at the age of 22, he purchases a huge home on Chestnut Street, where some of the city's most powerful residents live. He also befriends the owner and publisher of the Muscatine Journal. They would remain lifelong friends.
I think he moved into an absolutely unusual position within the community. I don't know how any young black man at the age of 22, could have positioned himself any better. And I think that he had a great deal of support in taking on a role that he lived the rest of his life.
Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe is published in 1852 and becomes the best-selling novel of the 19th century. It provokes a fierce nationwide debate about slavery. Iowa is a free state, but Muscatine, where Clark lives, is less than 90 miles from the border with Missouri, a slave state. And soon the area, like the nation, is divided in its views about race.
This is the newest part of the country, before the Civil War.
David Broadnax is a historian. He wrote his dissertation about Alexander Clark.
You have a lot of Southern whites moving to the Midwest because they, couldn't make a living in the South because they didn't own slaves. There are a few Quakers in small villages, especially in southeastern Iowa. There are some active Congregationalist ministers and churches that are actively involved in anti-slavery or, to a certain extent, in trying to fight for equality.
Some abolitionists from the Northeast also moved to Muscatine and established what they commonly refer to as Uncle Tom Cabin's Church. The renowned abolitionist, John Brown, makes frequent trips to eastern Iowa, finding willing recruits among the Quakers there. 4 of the men with Brown during his 1859 raid at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, are Iowans, including 2 Quaker brothers from eastern Iowa. One of them, Edwin Coppic, is hanged along with Brown. There is no evidence that John Brown and Alexander Clark ever meet, but Clark, whose mother and wife were both born into slavery, has by now become an activist. One form of Clark's activism is his support of fugitive slaves being sheltered at stops along the Underground Railroad.
We find more information all the time, and there's one interesting account of an Underground Railroad site a little bit north of here.
Daniel Clark of Muscatine is a descendant of what he calls Connecticut Yankee abolitionists who moved to Iowa in the mid-19th century. He's worked closely with Kent Sissel for decades and is now the webmaster of a site devoted to Alexander Clark's life.
The story is that it was a black man from Muscatine who regularly came out to provide food for the fugitives who were hiding out at this farm near Atalissa, Iowa. And so we don't know, was it Alexander Clark? Probably not Clark himself, but quite likely a member of his congregation, the AME Church here in Muscatine, which he helped found in 1848.
Being an African American before the Civil War, it's almost impossible to not have sympathy towards the slaves because you recognize that even if you're free, you're not that far removed from those who are enslaved. Another problem is the fact that there were a lot of kidnappings of free blacks. Even if you are free, there's always the possibility that you might become a slave.
Of course, some slaves escape and flee north to free states like Iowa, or somehow get there and try to stay. One is a slave named Jim White, whose story is chronicled in the Bloomington Herald under the headline, The Negro Case. White had been given permission by his master to work in Muscatine, but then refuses to return.
So his master sends agents to Muscatine to try to bring him back. And White takes refuge in Clark's home. Muscatine wasn't a big city and the black population was small, so it's likely that they knew each other just because they were both black in the same sort of mid-sized town. The bounty hunters try to trick Clark into handing White over, so they say, they pose as abolitionists and they say, we're going to help get Jim White to Chicago. So we're going to meet you on the other side of the Mississippi River. We want you to row him across and then we'll take him the rest of the way. But Alexander Clark was not an idiot, so he immediately smells a rat and he actually does take White on a boat, but they start sailing downstream until they can't be seen anymore and they just disappear in the middle of the night. The end result of the case is that White never goes back to Missouri. He spends, many years living in Muscatine as a free man after that, mainly because Clark came to his assistance.
Could it be that the man Clark aided, Jim White, was a basis for one of the most important figures in American literary history, the escaped slave, Jim, who evades capture by traveling down the Mississippi with Huck Finn? There is apparently nothing published to suggest this, but in the early 1850s, Only a few years after the Jim White case, another young man briefly moves to Muscatine to work on a local newspaper. His name is actually Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, who, of course, is the author of Huck Finn. Cecil fancies that Clark and the young Clemens might have crossed paths then and talked about the case.
I started thinking that if Samuel Clemens was in Muscatine in 1854, he undoubtedly knew Alexander G. Clark. And maybe, in fact, by that time, Alexander Clark had his barber shop going, and Alexander Clark may have cut Samuel Clemens' hair. The other thing that always raises curiosity for me is that if Sam Clemens happened to know Alexander Clark, more than likely the story of Jim White of Muscatine would have been told.
By the late 1850s, the nation is on the verge of civil war. Clark mobilizes African Americans throughout the Midwest to fight for the North. At the time, Iowa, like today, is overwhelmingly white. Census figures show its white population more than quadruples between 1840 and 1850, and then more than triples again by 1860 as Americans go west. Iowa's black population then is still paltry, though many African Americans who live in the state reside in Muscatine. In 1860, there are barely more than 1,000 blacks in Iowa, 1/6 of 1% of the population. Still, at the outbreak of the Civil War, an all-black unit, Iowa's 1st, which later becomes the U.S. 60th, is formed. It later fights in Arkansas. Clark apparently plays a pivotal role organizing the unit.
Alexander Clark became a recruiter for what was known as the Iowa 1st Volunteer Regiment of African American descent, or colored descent. Every recruiter received $2 for each recruit that they brought into military service. Alexander Clark gave the $2 back to each of his recruits so that they could buy uniforms, whatever they needed. Alexander Clark was not allowed to serve in the military because of a disability, but he did continually support the troops that he helped organize. He was chosen to present the flag to what became the U.S. 60th.
When the war ends, Clark's activism takes a new turn. At his urging, the men of the 60th meet in Davenport, Iowa, and draw up a petition demanding the right to vote.
What Clark and Frederick Douglass and other leaders were saying is, we've earned the right to vote. We went off and fought, even for a country that didn't treat us fairly. One of the famous quotes from Clark is that he who has been trusted with the musket can and ought to be trusted with the ballot.
1867 and 1868 turn out to be pivotal years in Clark's life. At about that time, a state legislator, John Lake Crookham, moves to strike the word white from the Iowa Constitution, and Clark's campaign to get African American men the right to vote finally succeeds. Clark's legal challenge to school desegregation in Iowa follows almost immediately after his voting rights crusade.
It was really in that context that in fall 1867, Clark came up with this legal challenge on education. The public school was right next to his house, whereas his children had to walk a mile or more to get to the black school, so why couldn't they attend the regular public school? This was the site of the black school where Clark's children attended before the Supreme Court case. Alexander, on behalf of his daughter Susan, brought a suit in the local magistrate's court. The court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, and so it was the school board that appealed to the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court ruled that the school had to be integrated, that all the children had equal rights.
In the fall of 1868, Clark's daughter enrolls in what had been Muscatine's all-white high school.
It is the first successful school desegregation case in the history of the United States. That makes the Clark case extremely important. It is subsequently cited in a number of cases around the country.
It is 86 years before the U.S. Supreme Court's historic Brown versus the Board of Education desegregation ruling. 89 years before federal troops are dispatched to Little Rock to help desegregate schools there. More than 90 years before James Meredith integrates the University of Mississippi. More than 90 years before Governor George Wallace stands in the doorway trying to block black students from entering the University of Alabama.
One other piece of the Clark case that's worth noting is that when desegregation finally comes to the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education, that a number of the briefs, that is the lawyers' written arguments for desegregation, cite the Clark case. They begin with the Clark case. They go back and they do the history and they say, oh my gosh, here's this case from 1868 from Iowa of all places, which says that you can't discriminate and you can't segregate blacks any more than you could segregate Germans or Irish or poor kids or Catholics. So in a sense, it takes the United States from 1868 to 1954 to catch up to Iowa.
In the years after the historic desegregation case, Clark's son, Alexander Jr., breaks the color barrier at the University of Iowa and graduates with a law degree in 1879. He later practices law in Oskaloosa, Iowa. In 1884, a second African American gets his law degree from the University of Iowa. It is Alexander Clark Sr. At the age of nearly 60, he graduates 8th in his class out of 80. He then moves to Chicago, where he becomes the editor and owner of the Chicago Conservator newspaper. A Conservator editorial published in 1886 calls on African Americans to read a newspaper published by an African American, saying it shows that we have the nerve and manhood to stand up and advocate through our own journals all privileges for our race that are enjoyed by white citizens of the country. Throughout this period, Clark continues to correspond with his longtime friend and associate, Frederick Douglass, the leading black abolitionist whose life, unlike Clark's, is still remembered and celebrated today.
We have some scattered letters between them. We have some newspapers where Douglass writes to Clark, and the letter is published in a newspaper. Clark responds in a newspaper. Douglass responds to that. Interestingly, in the published letter to Clark from 1888, he says, "We have been in the struggle for civil rights for 45 years. And then at the end, he says something about our 40-year friendship. So the implication is that Douglass has known Clark since the late 1840s, and Douglass is acknowledging that since the early 1840s, both of us have been involved in the civil rights struggle. That makes Clark significant.
In 1890, Clark, by now in his mid-60s, is dispatched by President Benjamin Harrison to Africa to represent the United States as its ambassador to Liberia. This explains what the woman in the car was referring to when she uttered the words, "the ambassador's house," on that drive through Muscatine back in the 70s, the event that transformed Kent Sissel's life. Clark dies in Liberia in 1891. His body is returned to Iowa. He's buried in this Muscatine cemetery overlooking the Mississippi. Ironically, part of his gravestone was sandblasted, and some of the information about his life has simply vanished, much like the story of how this influential African American has nearly vanished from the history books. Still, all of these years later, Sissel and others wonder why Clark has been lost in history. Many suspect it has to do with race.
Given this history, given the fact that really African Americans were ignored by most scholars for a very, very long time, it's not surprising that people like Alexander Clark would be forgotten.
We look at history through white eyes. And not all history is white. There are very few black historians. We have very few Native American historians. We have very few Chinese historians writing about what happened in the United States. I think Alexander Clark simply slipped through the boards.
One of our producers recently told a friend about Alexander Clark's life. The friend listened patiently and finally said something like, "That's really interesting, but you meant 1968, not 1868, right?" The producer assured him it was 1868, to which his friend replied, "Wow, Alexander Clark did live a remarkable life, and perhaps, at least we hope, he will no longer be lost in history." To find out more about Alexander Clark, go to the Iowa Public Television website, iptv.org. I'm Simon Estes, thanking you for joining us. Funding for Lost in History, Alexander Clark, has been provided by William Penn University and Musco Lighting, who are proud to support the telling of this Iowa story.